Welcome everyone. My name is Angela and I really dig it that you've decided to join me for another daily discovery with FCMoD. Today, in honor of our Explore Your State Week activities, we'll be exploring a very special fossil, Colorado's state fossil, the Stegosaurus. We'll go way back to the 1870s to learn when, where, and how the first Stegosaurus fossil was found. Then we'll jump up to the 1930s to learn about the Kessler Stegosaurus, which is really cool because it was found here in the state and it's also on display here in the state. And finally, we'll skip up to the 1980s to learn about a class of fourth graders who persevered to make the Stegosaurus Colorado's state fossil. So let's get to it. I am so glad that you made it here to our very first stop, the town of Morrison, Colorado in the year 1877. Now, to give you a little bit of context, the field of paleontology as we know it today was pretty much brand new at this point. It was only about 35 years earlier that the word dinosaur had even been coined in the English language. That being said, just because these fossils were new to the settlers coming from out east doesn't mean they were new finds in general. Different native communities had and continue to have their own stories and beliefs about what we call fossils today. According to the Colorado Commission on Indian Affairs, 48 tribes have historic ties to Colorado, plus the 2 Ute tribes whose nations exist in Colorado today. Today, we have to be willing to ask important questions about excavating and taking fossils. For example, when and where should fossils be allowed to be excavated? And who decides? Should fossils be bought and sold? If so, who has the right to buy and sell? These are really complex questions, but they're important to ask as we think about paleontology. All right, so back to the year 1877. An amateur geologist and school teacher named Arthur Lakes is taking a Sunday stroll with a friend in the hills just west of Denver in the town of Morrison, Colorado, when he comes across some giant fossils. There is one official professor of paleontology in the entire United States at this point, Othniel Charles Marsh of Yale College. Eager to recruit help and maybe a little bit of financial backing as well, Arthur Lakes writes a letter to this Professor O.C. Marsh of Yale College on April 2nd. No response. So, Lakes, he continues fossil hunting. And then on April 20th, he decides that he'll try again. So he writes to Professor O.C. Marsh. And still nothing. So finally on May 19th, Lakes decides to up the ante. And in addition to sending a letter to Marsh, he also sends a box of fossils. Now, not wanting to put all of his dinosaurs in one basket, so to speak, he decides that maybe he should also send some fossils to the other well-known paleontologist of the time, Professor Edward Drinker Cope. Edward Drinker Cope was a professor of zoology turned self-taught paleontology who belonged to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Now, let's get something straight here. O.C. Marsh and E.D. Cope are not friends. Not by this point anyway. They started out as pals, both interested in this new field of paleontology, but they quickly turned to vicious competitors, both on a quest to find and name more prehistoric creatures than the other guy. And they were absolutely ruthless. They would steal each other's fossils, they would try to take credit for each other's fossils, and they would generally just sabotage each other at every turn. Their rivalry is at the epicenter of the period in U.S. history we now call the Bone Wars. So, as you can imagine, both Cope and Marsh were eager not to let the other guy get into Morrison to excavate these fossils. And so Cope, he sends a letter back almost immediately to Arthur Lakes requesting that more fossils be sent his way. And meanwhile, Marsh, finally feeling the pressure, sends a letter back to Lakes along with a check for $100. After some negotiation, Lakes is hired onto Marsh's crew to help excavate that region. So a few months pass and Lakes is still busy excavating this quarry just near the town of Morrison when he comes across some very strange fossils indeed. And so he writes to Marsh and he describes these fossils as looking like the ends of spearheads or long spikes. And Marsh realizes immediately that this is a new dinosaur. And so Marsh names this dinosaur Stegosaurus. Now, Stegosaurus comes from the Greek. Stegos means roofed and saurus means lizard. So when we put those together, we get Stegosaurus, roofed lizard. And this might sound a little bit weird to us today, but it reflects Marsh's views on the animal at this time. Marsh didn't think that the plates of the Stegosaurus stood upright like we know that they do today. He thought that they laid flat against the back of the Stegosaurus like a roof on a house. And so our views of the Stegosaurus's anatomy have changed now as we've learned more about it, but that name, Stegosaurus, stuck. It turns out that the area that Lakes was excavating under the direction of Marsh was actually part of a much larger rock unit that we now call the Morrison Formation. The Morrison Formation extends all the way from Montana to New Mexico, although it's mostly centered here in Colorado and in Wyoming. And since this formation is mostly made up of sedimentary rocks, we found since the time that Lakes started excavating that it is absolutely teeming with Jurassic fossils. So now we're going to go about 85 miles south of Morrison as the crow flies to a little town called Canyon City, Colorado, to learn about another really cool Stegosaurus find here in Colorado. I'm so glad you made it here with me to the year 1936. And it's time for us to meet a new character in our Stegosaurus story. His name is Frederick Carl Kessler. Like Arthur Lakes, Kessler was actually a school teacher. He taught history at Canyon City High School in Canyon City, Colorado, starting back in the 1920s. And one day in 1936, he was with his students on an expedition of the Garden Park fossil area, which is about just 10 miles north of Canyon City, when he and his students came across what they knew to be a significant find. And so Kessler, the amateur geologist that he was, called on the Denver Museum of Natural History to come check it out. And so the Denver Museum of Natural History comes down and they agree with Kessler that this is a significant find, and they make plans to start excavating the fossil with the landowner's permission. Now, my favorite part of this story is that Kessler, he was an educator at heart, so he wanted to do whatever he could to make sure that his students could be involved in the excavation as well. And this was happening in the 1930s, so it was the years of the Great Depression, and the president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt had set up a program to help with the Great Depression called the National Youth Administration. And so the students in Mr. Kessler's class were actually able to be paid 25 cents an hour to help excavate this fossil through the National Youth Administration, which I think is just a super cool part of this story. Now, Kessler and his class and the Denver Museum of Natural History spent several years excavating, and they finally finished in 1939. And that's when the Stegosaurus fossil went to be displayed at the then Denver Museum of Natural History. And you can actually still see this same fossil today at the now called Denver Museum of Nature and Science, the same exact place, just a different name, as part of their exhibition called Prehistoric Journeys. So next time you're able to visit the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, I would make sure that you check that fossil out. Now, in the 1980s, our next stop on our journey, we'll see how this Kessler Stegosaurus was able to inspire a class of 4th graders to make the Stegosaurus Colorado's state fossil. In the year 1980, about 100 years after that very first Stegosaurus find, a group of 4th grade students at McElwain School in Thornton, Colorado, have just finished a unit on dinosaurs. And they wonder if Colorado has a state fossil like a handful of other states do. So they do a little bit of research and they find out that Colorado doesn't have a state fossil. And they really want to do something to change this. And so, with the help of their teacher, Ruth Sato, they submit a bill to the Colorado State Senate requesting that the Stegosaurus, and specifically the Kessler Stegosaurus, becomes Colorado's state fossil. So these 4th graders turn into 5th graders, and they are constantly recruiting more children and more adults to be part of their cause. And in 1981, they get the issue through the state Senate, but it doesn't get through the House. And so these students petition then Governor Richard Lamb to put their issue on the 1982 legislative agenda. And Richard Lamb does, and it still takes a little bit of time, but on April 28, 1982, then Governor Richard Lamb proclaimed the Stegosaurus as Colorado's state fossil. And this story to me shows that no matter how old you are or how young you are, you can stand up for things that matter to you and you can make a difference. Thank you so much for joining me and Fort Collins Museum of Discovery for another Daily Discovery. I hope you enjoyed our time learning together. For more fun and exploration, make sure you visit the museum's website at FCMoD.org/programs for a new video or activity each day. And make sure that you check out the activity that goes with this video, where you can make your very own Stegosaurus. See you next time.